All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Global Development. Welcome to the, let me get this right, RISE Country Research Vision and Planning session. The main point of this whole event is for everybody in the room to come away, well, hopefully excited, but also having their questions answered. We'll have a long time for Q&A at the end, but I'm completely okay. If you don't understand what we're talking about, please raise your hand and let's take questions along the way if they're pressing. What is RISE about? Why are we doing all this? Kind of one of the starting points is that there's been incredible global success in the movement for universal primary education and universal schooling. Not without pockets of exclusion, but there's been incredible progress. So simple charts, if we look at World Bank report, low-income households girls versus high-income households boys, from 1990 over the course of 20 years, we're seeing double-digit increases in grade 6 completion rates for low-income girls, lesser for high-income boys. We're seeing some convergence, basically, that that gender and wealth gap beginning to converge on the dimension of enrollment, basically getting kids into school. Obviously, some of us know, conveniently we don't have, say, girls in Pakistan on that graph where you would see less impressive numbers. But the progress we've made in enrollment has not always been coupled with incredible progress in terms of learning outcomes. And kind of the starting point for RISE is what we're calling a learning crisis, a failure of schools in many low-income developing countries to produce real learning gains. So just as an illustration, look at the fraction of children who are either innumerate or illiterate, basically fail to meet some basic competency level on a standardized test. The majority of kids in the countries we're listing here, South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, who are not able to read, who are not able to do simple addition and subtraction, it's not because they're not enrolled, they're in school and they're failing to achieve these basic competencies. Right? So the lack of learning, the learning crisis is not just about failure to get more kids in school. It's a necessary first step, but it's the failing to achieve the learning we want to see conditional on achieving enrollment gains. All right, which brings the agenda, which I think a lot of the research community has kind of made this pivot simply from schooling to focus on learning outcomes. And a lot of, there's been an explosion both in education schools and in economics programs or experimental research on what works to improve student learning and student outcomes. And this is just one example to illustrate a point. This is from a recent meta-analysis of ICT programs, computers in the classroom essentially, and their effects on learning outcomes, on standardized tests. And what I want to take away from this is there have been a lot of attempts to measure the impact of putting computers in classrooms. Is that the answer? It's a very kind of isolated intervention to improve learning outcomes. And we have kind of the full range of answers. We have everything from it has a positive and significant effect of half a standard deviation. That's an RCT, well identified. All the way down to a negative, significant, large effect, perverse outcomes from a computer-assisted learning program in India. So incredible heterogeneity in the results. Now, that probably has something to do with the different contexts where these different programs are happening, but it also has something to do with the different designs of the different programs. We're lumping a lot of things into one category of ICT or computer-assisted learning. But we don't yet have a good theory of why this works some places and why it doesn't, what elements of the program were important and which weren't, what complementary policies and programs needed to be in place and which didn't. So this is just kind of one example of how much, but also kind of how little we understand at this point. We had, some of you hopefully maybe tuned in online last week. It was a Thursday and Friday. I've lost track of time already. We had a kind of academic-oriented conference, kind of launched the RISE program in Washington, D.C. Had lots of education researchers come in and discuss kind of what they're doing now in this space with an eye towards where we should go from here. And I just want to reflect on a few of the presentations I saw as kind of elements that we saw coming out of what systems research might look like. One of the things that came out was a focus on complementarities. Not just on an individual policy intervention and does it work or not work, but what are the complementary policies and pieces and institutions that need to be in place. Examples from Indonesia and Tanzania. So this is a paper that Karthik Muralidharan talked about in Indonesia. Indonesian government introduces a policy to improve teacher certification. Teacher certification is going to come with a doubling of teacher salaries in primary schools. and negotiated as part of that a change in how teachers are promoted and held accountable for learning outcomes. So kind of a civil service reform coupled with a major increase in teacher salary. Well, across all points of the test score distribution, the proportion of kids who were exposed to an accredited teacher went up dramatically. So they succeeded in the intervention, but the whole kind of accountability and civil service reform portion was dropped, and the outcome was across the board, the entire score distribution, zero gain in test scores from the doubling in teacher pay. Now, what we take from this is not that teacher pay doesn't matter and we shouldn't raise teacher salaries everywhere or anywhere, but that there are obviously other things that need to be put in place, and we failed to learn from this what those were because they didn't get carried out and implemented. Scale and implementation, teaching assistance examples from Kenya and Ghana. My own work has been trying to kind of replicate successful programs of working with teaching assistants in classrooms in Kenya, a successful NGO program that was able to produce kind of the standard 0.2 standard deviations increase in learning outcomes, reading and math. When the government Ministry of Education tries to replicate the same program with the same budget, implementation falls apart, there are salary delays, teachers are not where they're supposed to be, and ostensibly on paper the same program falls apart, produces zero gain. We had at the conference last week Andy Duflo talking about a similar program in Ghana where a kind of a loose description of what it was about was trying to get the NGO program and the Ministry of Education program to marry themselves together and do some sort of joint implementation. And they had, this is purely coincidence, the scales aren't really comparable, but basically an intermediate treatment effect in terms of outcomes. And the last bit we talked quite a bit about on the second day of the conference last week was political economy and needing to bring in a political economy angle to the research we're doing. We had Michael Kramer talking about a voucher program in Colombia, 125,000 scholarships in the 1990s for poor students to attend private, what ended up being mostly vocational schools. And there was rationing of these scholarships by lottery, setting up a long-term research program that's been going on for at least a decade now. And they see increases in tertiary enrollment, reduced fertility among the girls, increased earnings at age 30 by about 10%. So big outcomes. And their kind of public finance calculation is that just the increased tax revenue you get from the increased earnings from this program is enough to pay for the program. A huge gain for the government. And yet, some of the policy people in the room were raising their hands and saying, but I work in Colombia, they've canceled that program. Some of the best minds in education research have shown that this was a huge success, and yet it doesn't exist anymore. So what went wrong? What happened? What didn't we understand? And what do we need to understand about a program like this better? These are going to be large, kind of multi-year funding opportunities for a relatively small number of teams. We're putting most of our eggs in a very small number of baskets. That means there's going to need to be big organizational capacity. This is not something that the night before the due date you can sit down at your laptop and hammer out a proposal and mail in. We're expecting, big collaborations, possibly among multiple institutions, to put in serious bids. Some common focus. This is not, a completely open call. We have a kind of a common focus on how to achieve a dramatic increase in learning levels, but in very different places, possibly through very different pathways. So some commonality in what we're doing. What we're kind of expecting in the winning bids, and I will come back to this again and again, but there's going to be a strong institutional presence and research participation in the country of study. We don't see this as something that can be completely phoned in or dialed in from the UK or Europe or the US. There is definitely an expectation that there's going to be strong international research involvement in all of these programs, which is why we're standing here talking to you. But we're also, from here, going to be, I'm not, but some people around, well, I will be getting on one plane, I guess. Well, we'll be heading off to do similar meetings in Dar es Salaam, Abuja, Islamabad, Delhi, Jakarta, and so on. So we really want to emphasize that this would be collaborative with people in the countries where you're doing research. Multidisciplinary teams. I'm an economist. This is not just about economics. We really want and are committed to not just multidisciplinarity across the different the different proposals, but within each of the proposals. And then this collaboration and coordination thing. Like I said, these are not completely autonomous and isolated programs where each team would be working on their own thing without talking to anybody else. There's a couple of elements where we're going to want everybody, the RISE program as a whole, to function as some sort of coherent thing where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, hopefully. One of those would probably be an initial diagnostic exercise. Lant Pritchett, our research director, who I should have at least introduced by name at the beginning, Lant Pritchett's taking a strong interest in kind of working with the teams to do a diagnostic that would help inform a clear analytical framework for the rest of the research. And this would probably be a working paper that would be expected from each of the teams. That wouldn't be a huge slice of your time or budget, but just as an illustration of the kinds of, there would be some outputs that would not be just for teams to write their own TORs completely in isolation. And similarly on learning metrics, this is not a program about defining a unified testing system for all countries. And we don't want to put huge time and effort and budget into that. But where it makes sense to do things in a comparable way, we want to take advantage of that comparability if we can. And so what we see is sort of an opt-in, kind of a voluntary approach to harmonization among winning research teams. Not that anybody would be beholden to use a specific metric, but that kind of principal investigators and all the teams would be expected to come together and bang their heads together and get as much comparability as they can without compromising their own research needs and their specific program. We're very attentive to the fact that you get geniuses involved by letting geniuses do whatever they want to do, that you get the best organizations and the best researchers excited about things by giving them scope to do their own thing, and we're going to try to tread lightly in terms of taxing researchers so that we don't scare people off too much.
We're dovetailing pragmatics with substance, and so just to be, we're going to talk a little bit about the pragmatics of the overall research agenda, the sequence, timing of bidders, what kinds of research the overall program is looking to fund. Nothing about results, nothing about T-tables, nothing about that. So if you don't want to hear that, you can go in the other room and chat with other people about other things. If you do want to hear that, or if you know someone out there who wants to hear that, come in. So we've sort of we want to separate the audiences because this is a very different thing than what's gone on so far. So I am going to, I first want to talk about the research scope, and then we will get into organizational structure. And as we get into organizational structure, you'll see how this overall research agenda is being managed. And then I will turn it over to Karen, who is part of the management of the research structure, to talk about some additional details. So the overall research endeavor is being funded by DFID, which is the British Agency for Assistance, and they have set up a research program in order to precisely look at these issues of systems and how systems can be transformed to overcome the learning crisis. So it takes for granted a lot of things. This is not DFID's only support to education research. So it has many other supports to education research of very many types, but this is one component of the research, and hence think of this as one narrow sort of, this is a product in the space of people that are funding research that has these specific agendas, rather than that DFID or anyone else thinks this is the entirety of the research agenda that needs to happen in education. So many, many, many types of research, disciplines of research, modalities of research need to happen in the world. This is just the one that we happen to be doing. So we want an analytical framework for how systems function, how system change happens, why it doesn't happen, and how reform and success doesn't happen. We want to measure, those are the questions we're asking. We want success measured by learning gains. We're not looking for success as measured by having done what you thought would lead to success. We want success measured by some concrete outcome, in particular learning gains. we're trying to, through this overall research agenda, build a community of practice of people interested in growing systems research. As Kara mentioned, it took a while to sort of say, geez, in the domain of research on health, you've got these people doing clinical trials of drug to disease outcome. There's this larger systems research. How do we build that body and community of practice? And it is a research agenda. One of its outputs is intended to be publication in top journals. It's meant to produce the kinds of rigorous evidence that can stand up to any kind of scrutiny. The system research characteristics, so what kinds of research are we looking for? We're looking, again, for research that's hypothesized to affect learning. And again, I say this in the context of there's lots of things it could be about, but this does not happen to be about enrollment. It's more about the learning of the kids that are now in school. We're looking for scaled or potential scale for things. We're not looking for the boutique things that could be done in 6 villages or in 6 schools. We're looking for things that have potential for scale. We're looking for things that are fit to the context. Again, we're not, and I'm partly defining it by I'm saying what it is and saying what it's not. We're not necessarily looking for research into the best practice of what Finland did, but what are the reforms that can actually happen in these contexts that can lead them from where they are to where they want to be? So we want to research things that are fit to the context, potential for success, support of implementers, meaning the kinds of things that, again, in these contexts can and will be scaled by people who can implement it, and a focus on basic education. There's lots of other domains of education. The education system consists of tertiary education, consists of vocational education. That's just not our focus. Our focus is basic education. So we're looking for things in basic education that can generate the support of implementers to have high success that are fit to the context of the country in which the research is done, has scale or potential to scale, and has there's some learning chain of the type Kara was showing about health. There's some causal chain in which the outcome of the causal chain is learning gains. Right? This can take many forms. It can be one or many forms with system elements or automation. It can be a whole or a part of the system, meaning all systems consist of sort of the overall system, and then there's components of system like assessment, components of the system like how teachers are pre-service trained, selected, hired. There's there's parts of systems about school autonomy. There's parts of system about how it interfaces with non-state providers. The research can be national or subnational, and the time horizon, in some sense, can be past, present, or future, in the sense that not the distant future, obviously, but meaning these could be reforms that are about to be undertaken that we're going to track over the course of their implementation. It could be we're engaged with research on programs that are now happening. It could be with things that have happened recently for which we can adequately document their impacts. So I think there's a table. Did that table get cut out? Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. What is systems research? Some examples. And again, these are examples. We're encouraging people who want to, say, geez, I'm interested in putting together a proposal. These are just examples. So reforms in teacher policy, recruitment, retention, training, supervision, management, pay. All of those are sub-elements of how, the teaching system works. And again, we want the teaching system. So for instance, Michael Kramer, was Kramer part of this? No, you weren't, were you? Yeah, you were, yeah. Kramer has an interesting paper in Kenya about the contract teachers and how the contract teachers outperform in Kenya, right? That's an interesting element of teacher policy. Would be more interested in how you take that to scale. What does that reveal about the way in which teacher policies can have impact on learning and how you would take that to scale? Student assessment reforms. One of the components of systems is how are students assessed? How do those assessed feed back into the changed practices? How do the student assessments affect student careers? How do the assessment systems affect all kinds of things? So student assessment is a subcomponent of a system reform. Increasing teacher or school autonomy. That is, what are the kinds of things that schools are capable of doing? What are the kinds of things in which schools are, dictated what they will have to do? Or are we changing the scope of things over which schools can exercise autonomy and make choices? So again, the example Kartik was giving of like, okay, we're going to have each school develop its own school improvement plan and give it autonomy to choose certain things. That would be an interesting, again, systems research thing. Teaching to the level of student, which is basically things around curriculum reform, things around how you change kind of how the curriculum meets up with a student, would be an interesting subcomponent. Low-cost private schools, again, all of these are examples of, and we're not limited to, but these are the kinds of things we're thinking about. Does everybody get this? Meaning, I'm not trying to be doctrinaire about what constitutes system reform, but we're trying to differentiate system reform from what isn't system reform. What isn't systems research is, necessarily small, geographically limited, implement-oriented interventions without complementary system reform elements. So knowing more about availability of the pure availability of textbooks just doesn't constitute system research unless it's integrated within how we're simultaneously changing the content of the textbooks to be more aligned with improved teachers or who choose. Pure focus on enrollment. Again, we got nothing against enrollment. We're huge fans of enrollment, right? But it's just not the thing in which incremental research of the system type is needed. Things without potential for scale, so things that you can prove that you and 6 other people from Ivy League institutions can go to Kenya and do, but which has no potential for scale, just not interested in it. And sort of what fits in this is things designed solely by researchers we're a little bit leery of, right? Meaning if the researcher is in fact designing the implementation, it may well lead us to, without deep local engagement, it makes us a little nervous that this isn't the kind of thing that has potential for scale in the country. And then here's just the time element. This is past, present, and future, right? And sort of proximate sort of inputs-based components of systemic reform, major systemic reform. Our interest is more here. Meaning we're interested in research that's going to follow the implementation of components and or major system reform that provides us, information about their impacts. We're open to retrospective if one can generate, and this is often the key limitation, if one can generate true rigorous evidence about their relative impacts, which is, as everybody knows, is hard to do. We're slightly interested in prospective, but with it's got to be highly likely to happen. And all we're saying is the magnitude of the resources we're going to put into this is not the magnitude of resources with which you're going to introduce any country to do anything. Right? Countries are not going to undertake reform on the premise that if we undertake reform, we're going to get this money to do research. So if you say we want to do research about this, and this is almost certainly going to happen, that's a great proposal. If we say, oh, with this research money, we're going to induce the government to do something that it wouldn't otherwise do, we doubt it. We just doubt it because we don't, it's not that kind of magnitude or scale of funding. And so if you're looking for prospective research, we're all in favor of it, but we're not, through this research program, we don't intend to induce innovations that wouldn't have otherwise been on the political and implementation agenda. Does everybody get that? I mean, I'll follow questions. No. You understood that? Okay, see you. Okay, then. I hoped I hadn't driven him out by that. But again, we're trying to stay away from here, trying to stay in here. We're open to this, right? But again, if you say, we think that if we come with this research program, India is going to do something different about education that it wouldn't otherwise do, the answer is no, they're not. Because we don't have that kind of researcher clout. Okay, then we have 7 preferred countries in which, for a variety of reasons, we're looking for research proposals. These countries are a combination of being DFID priority countries, because this is originally DFID financed, and originally we'll get to what I mean by that, combined with other factors of places that we think research in this is likely going to be particularly interesting, plus other different priority countries, and there's a list of other different priority countries, meaning we're particularly interested in those. If you think, shoot, I'm not in one of those, but I'm doing something that's fantastically interesting, but it's on the DFID eligible list, we're also interested in that in the first round. And then finally, a subnational program within these countries is perfectly, India. India is a huge continent. If you say, well, one state of India is going to do this, subnational programs is certainly feasible, and we may, in fact, from these 7 countries, choose 2 regional programs rather than 1 large country program. So it's not 1 per country. It doesn't have to be the whole country. Subnational focus is perfectly acceptable, particularly in lots of these large countries where, education is a federal responsibility with lots of subnational variation. The idea is that there is a RISE directorate, which is going to do these things. And there is going to be a call for bids in which country research, there's going to be, in the first round, we hope, 3 country research teams that are going to put together research proposals to develop this, and this will all work together as one very big happy team. So this is the next stage of this. There's an intellectual research team that consists of a variety of disciplinary and research and practical approaches to the field of education that have been meeting with us in order to help us develop the terms of reference and proposals that we will use to submit to sort of solicit bids. Once those happen, those will work in a supportive, not in a supportive, not management sense, and then manage the program will flow through the RISE directorate. Ideally, we think the country research teams that are going to be the, the proposals that would be funded under this research program are going to consist of in-country and international education and methodological experts working together, meaning we want the teams integrated into the domestic policy dialogue, because in order to know what's really going to happen in the country, what's likely to happen in the country, what's likely to have support of the implementers, what's likely to be useful, you want people that actually know the country rather than arbitrage on where has a natural experiment happened where I as a researcher can take advantage of it, right? We want ties to the relevant institutions, deep understanding of the system context of the country in which it's done, and involved in the design, analysis, writing as co-PIs, meaning we want local teams deeply involved. And then any research method used in RISE should be justified by best fit with a research question. Which I hope that's not too subtle, meaning if you want to do an RCT, we will certainly entertain an RCT. If you don't want to do an RCT and you think the RCT methodology isn't the best fit the research question you have, we're open to a wide variety of things. We're open to qualitative approaches, we're open to quantitative approaches, but in the proposal would justify why the approach being taken to the research is the best approach to produce rigorous evidence about what you're trying to trace out. So we are not asking, so range of quantitative and qualitative approaches, process case and impact studies, output is the highest research standard in the relevant discipline. This is not a call for RCTs. This is not a call for non-RCTs. This is a call for research into interesting questions about system reform in education that will lead to system learning gains, and whatever methods you think are appropriate to trace out not all of the causal channels through which that will lead, we're open to that. So I don't know if you noticed Kara's presentation. It was a very intriguing presentation of how would we trace out all the causal paths, how would we establish plausibility of the causal paths. So we're interested in rigorous research about really complex and important questions about systems, and so we are not prejudging that any particular methodology is the appropriate approach to that those sets of questions. That said, we're looking to produce research, and we're looking to produce research that's the highest possible standard. Does everybody get that? I mean, it's there's all kinds of tensions going on in lots of disciplines that I'm skirting over, but that's what we're doing, okay? So that's... What? No. No. In fact, one of the members of our intellectual leadership team is a sociologist who specializes in ethnography, but she specializes in ethnography that tracks how the stakeholders in the system perceive the reform and why different narratives about the reform, in fact, often ends up being a blocking factor in why reforms don't happen. So she does research into why, for instance, the different narrative coming out of the Ministry of Education versus what the teachers are having. But if you're doing ethnography, it's the highest possible research standard in how to do ethnography. So again, if we think that a key component in blocking implementation of reform is different underlying narratives about what the reform is about as it percolates across and through the system of parents, teachers, administrators, politicians, we're perfectly open into research that traces that out. Really open to it. We have added a member of the intellectual research team. One is Kartik, one is Susan Watkins, who's a sociologist who does narratives. So when we say multidisciplinary, multi-thing, we mean it because we've assembled teams that are sympathetic to all, we've assembled an overall team that's sympathetic to all approaches. We strongly encourage, as you might have noticed, kind of use of standardized metrics. The more in which you can make your research comparable to other things that are happening in the field, the better. That said, we're not dictating that one uses a particular method, but we're not encouraging you to invent a new method where one exists. So if there is a method for measuring what you want, a method that other people have done, we'd encourage you to say, gee, if I did it this way, it would be comparable to things that have gone before. So there's measures of learning assessment, and they're out there, and there's lots of them, and we're not encouraging you to create a new one. There's lots of intermediate measures, like if we want to measure teacher classroom practices, there are lots of ways to measure classroom practices. The World Bank has spent decades developing service delivery indicators, measures of practice, so we encourage people to make their research as comparable as possible to other things. That said, we are not looking to create cross-nationally comparable data. This is not the DHS. Everybody knows the Demographic and Health Survey. The Demographic and Health Survey, its purpose is to create cross-nationally comparable facts about the world. That's not what we're doing. That said, the maximum comparability we can get, the better, but we're not attempting to create cross-nationally comparable facts about the world. It's just, I don't think, compatible with really doing research about causal pathways. And so we want representativeness and comparability. There's going to be a system diagnostic required at inception and closeout, which is we're going to try and create a I shouldn't be so pessimistic about our own abilities. We're going to create a sort of diagnostic that situates what you're doing inside of, here's how I would characterize the current operation of the system I'm in. Here are the features of the system that this reform is going to change, and here's how I think those will interact, just as expressions of causal hypotheses, right? We've already seen that lots of things are contextual, but when people use the word contextual, they often use the word contextual in a non-contextualized way. So they say it's contextual, and that's like going to a tailor who says one size doesn't fit all. And you go, yeah, I know one size doesn't fit all, but what are you going to measure? And if you go to a tailor, he measures your inseam. That's the thing he measures, because that's a context that matters for pants, right? So what we're trying to say is we're going to try and develop a system where we are going to develop a system that conceptualizes the system elements so that there's a common vocabulary for describing what system reforms are. So we describe assessment systems, we describe teacher systems, and you do a diagnostic at the beginning and say, here are hypotheses about how the system is currently working. Here is the elements of that system that this reform is going to change. Here are the things that we think this is complementary to, and here's the things that we think it isn't complementary to, and here's how we hypothesize, therefore, in a characterization like Kara was giving, how we think the overall causal pathway is going to work in this context.
So I will not be talking about the actual intellectual content of the bids, but much more about the administrative process to getting them submitted. Yeah, if there are any questions, there's a lot of time at the end. Also, a lot of this, most of it will actually be online, so you can check back. Okay, so bidding for RISE is a 3-stage process, and we're in the first one, sort of supply engagement, where the EOI have not been officially released. The second stage is then the expression of interest, EOI, which will be released on the 1st of July. The next slide is a timeline, so then you'll see how much time you have. And the last stage is proposal writing. In this section, I'll talk mainly about the funding, the scheduling of each stage, and then what are the requirements, what do we expect from you, and then also how do you interact with us? How do you ask questions, and how do we give you feedback, and how do you submit your bids? So the total funding envelope is 21 million, and this is funding for up to 5 research teams, 5 country research teams. The first call, which is the one that we're in right now, is for up to 3 teams. And research implementation is planned to start in March 2016 and then roll on for 6 years. The second call is for, again, up to 3 countries. Depending on the quality of bids, the total will make up 5. The EOIs for those will be issued March 2016, so basically when the first call starts work, the second one will then start submitting their EOIs. And research implementation will start from September 2016. Bidders are invited to resubmit both EOIs and proposals. We will, if your bid was unsuccessful at the first time or even the EOI, you will get feedback. But I'll talk about this later, so this will allow you to judge how much sense it makes to resubmit or not. As Justin said, this is quite a substantial program. So RISE won't review bids that are less than 3 million. And sort of you can do the sums with 5 programs, and the total envelope is 21 million, so I invite you to do the math about what kind of envelope we're expecting. And awards are made in British pounds, even though the bidder or the lead organization does not have to be in the UK. That's just the award. Okay, so this is the timeline in more detail. The launch of the program took place last week in DC, so that was the June 18th. And in parallel, as Justin also said, there are a number of supplier engagement events. One of them we're having right now in the UK, and there's Tanzania, Nigeria, India, Pakistan, and Indonesia to follow over the next month. The expression of interests will officially be launched on the 1st of July. Now, what is this document? Basically, there'll be a PDF file available online, which is the form that we will expect you to complete and to submit online on the 23rd of August. The form will not yet be live at that stage. It will become live at some point during this period when we've had enough time to test it. But a Word or PDF document will come out on the 1st of July, and you can download it and you'll see what we expect from you at the EOI stage. Now, the TOR, the terms of reference, unusually are already out. They have been published on, I think this week or late last week, and they can be downloadable. These terms of reference refer to the bid. They don't refer to the expression of interest, but we've published them so that you can refer to them so that you will know what will be expected from you. But they're not the terms of reference linked to the EOI, they're linked to the final bid. The requirements for the EOI will be published on 1st of July. And up until 23rd of August, which is the submission date for the EOI, we would encourage you to start asking us questions, but also build consortia, etc. After the submission of EOI, we'll be reviewing them for 2 weeks. We've made huge efforts to compress this to give you as much time as possible to then go back to writing. And you'll hear from us by September 7th about if you're invited to bid or if you're not invited to bid. And you then have until the 1st of November to write your proposals. The notice of award after you've submitted on November 1st, will be no later than 4th January. So this is quite a long time. If we're fast, we might be able to notify you in this year, but because of the Christmas holidays, we just wanted to be careful, and so we're giving you a date of notification for 4th of January. It might be earlier. Country research teams are expected to start work by March 2016. So in the time plans that you will be preparing for your proposals, we'd expect you to work with the March 2016 deadline. Now, what do we expect you to do over this period? So for the launch, of course, there's no submission expected. This is just sort of to raise questions, to engage with us. The only thing we'd like you to, or we invite you to do, learn about RISE, attend these events, check out our website, and importantly, find partners. So this is, and as Justin mentioned before, this is quite a big project which will very likely require complex consortia. So one of the really important things to do right now would be to find out who you might want to partner with. And this room is booked for until 5 o'clock, and we'll probably finish earlier, so I invite you all to just have tea, coffee, and talk to each other. Then the expression of interest details will be published on July 1st, as I mentioned. The submission is a 7-page document via a web portal, and you'll have to submit it on the 23rd of August. And things that you will have to specify in it are things like your target country and your form, research questions, and some bidder info. But you'll see more detail coming out next Wednesday. During this time, you can also ask questions. Questions will be run through an online form where you can submit questions, and we will then regularly update FAQs. You will not receive individual replies. You can attend supplier engagement events. If you have partners in country, we also invite those to come to the supplier events and volunteer for matchmaking. So if you know good organizations that might partner up, why don't you just send them an email or give them a call and say, I think you would be really interested to partner with this person. So, I mean, this is voluntarily, but if you're interested, but you feel you can't bid or somebody else might be interested, by all means, please share. Questions for feedback. So as I said before, you can submit questions from 1st of July onwards. We will close questions on the 20th. Sorry, this should be 20th of August, not July. Apologies. And also on the 1st of July, we'll give you more details on the whole process. It's very simple. It's just an online form, so you'll see it. After the EOI, all bidders will receive feedback. So you submit the EOI, and we will then, those of you who have bid for a different, have probably seen a feedback form. You will receive something very similar for us, where you will learn your relative, unusually your relative rank. So if you're in the top tertile, middle tertile, or end tertile, as well as the score. And these tertiles, we hope to be an indicator of your likely success to proposal, or if we would encourage you or not to resubmit. This is just an indicator of how you rank relative to other people. And we may also suggest that complementary bidders discuss potential cooperation. So if we receive 2 EOIs and we feel they're very complementary, we might tell them both, I think you would benefit from talking to X, and you might benefit from talking to Y. It is then up to you to make the link yourselves. Now, requirements for proposals. This will become more clear in detail on September 7th, but details that we publish at that date will be what is the format of proposal that we want from you, what are the contact points, so if you have questions, submission details, also any conflict of interest or disclosure issues, and duty of care statements. The submission of the proposal, as I said before, is November 1st.